Good morning and most welcome to 1322. I am currently at the City Library where a lecture summary will be held of the first book of Iain McGilchrist, The Matter with Things. And this is the totality of the book I will take up in this brief summary. Something to stand on. Rather a hard floor here. Much better. The Matter with Things by Iain McGilchrist, or rather Dr. Iain McGilchrist. It is a bit of a piece of work, the book, so it's broken into two chunky volumes, each of them spanning over 700 pages. And rather densely written. For you whom are acquainted with the master and his emissary, you will recognize the rather dense style, but eloquent and sharp of McGilchrist. And without a doubt, the master and his emissary is without comparison one of the most compelling books of the 21st century. And it's rather large as well. It's three main questions both parts are trying to answer. The first part, what does it mean, or what do we have at our disposal in the world? And what paths should we follow in approaching the world? In the second part, what can we say about the form, the structure, and nature of this world? The different means of approach. See this as different modes or attitudes, Stimmung. The means of approach, the world reduced. Reductionism envisages a universe of things and simply material things at that. How these things are related is viewed as a secondary matter. Iain suggests that relationships are primary. foundational than the things related. That the relationships do not just connect pre-existing things, but modify what we mean by things. Which in turn modify everything else they are in relationship with. That is because what we are dealing with are ultimately relations, events, processes, and things is a useful shorthand for those elements. Congealed in the flow of experience. That emerge secondarily from and attract our attention in a primary web of interconnections. So complexity is the norm, and simplicity represents a special case of complexity. Achieved by cleaving off and disregarding almost all of the vast reality that surrounds whatever it is we are for the moment modeling as simple. That is, simplicity is a feature of our model, not of the reality that is modeled. What is the nature of reality? In the last century or so, there has been a tendency, at least in popular discourse, to pull reality in opposing directions. Some scientists whether they put it this way or not, when they are asked to reflect, still carry on as if there just exists a reality. Out there. Shortened sometimes in the book, ROT, reality out there. The nature of which is independent of any consciousness of it. Naive realism. These are usually biologists. You will today not find many physicists who would think that. In reality, we participate in the knowing. There's no view from nowhere. The last thing is evidently from Thomas Nagel. Meanwhile, on the other hand, there are philosophers of the humanities who think that there is no such thing as reality, since it's all made up miraculously by ourselves. Naive idealism. Such people, by the way, never behave as though there was no reality. Nor, of course, by its own logic, can they claim any truth for their position. These viewpoints are closer than they look. One party fears that if what we call reality in any sense contaminated by our own involvement, in bringing it about, it would no longer be worthy of being called real. The other fears that since we manifestly do play a part in its coming about, it's already the case that it cannot be called real. But just because we participate in reality doesn't mean we invent it out of nowhere. or solipsistically project it on some inner mental screen. Much less does it mean that the very idea of reality is thereby invalidated. Why are the two brain hemispheres divided? Every animal, in order to survive, has to solve a conundrum. How to eat without being eaten. It has to pay precisely focused, narrow beam attention that is already committed to whatever is of interest to it. So as to exploit the world for food and shelter. Put as its absolute simplest, a bird must be able to pick out a seed from the whole of the universe. Pick it up swiftly and accurately. Similarly, with a twig to build a nest. Yet, if the bird is to survive, it must also at one and the same time pay another kind of attention to the world, which is the precise opposite of the first. Broad kind of attention to the world, which is the precise opposite of the first. Broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention, on the lookout for predators or for conspecifics. For friend or foe, but also crucially open to the appearance of the utterly unfamiliar. Whatever may exist in the world of which it had no previous knowledge. This is close to complementarity. Particle for the specific, wave for the universal, non-local. The unfamiliar whatever may exist in the world of which it had no previous knowledge. The apeiron. How on earth can you dispose your consciousness towards the world in two utterly conflicting ways at once? The answer is the illusion of two neuronal masses separate enough to function independently. But connected enough to work in concert with one another, each capable of sustaining consciousness on its own. In other words, a bipartite brain thus the need to sustain two incompatible takes on the world simultaneously explains that this is the extraordinary why the brain is so deeply divided. You can survive with the two hemispheres cut at the capsum callosum, meaning they have no connection at all, and still manage a fulfilling life. The key right hemisphere versus left hemisphere difference. The right hemisphere is better at seeing things as they are pre-conceptually. Fresh, unique, embodied, and as they presence to us. This word presence is very close to the Heideggerian term. The left hemisphere then sees things as they are represented, literally present again. After the fact, as already familiar abstractions or signs. One could say that the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of theory. The right hemisphere, that of experience. The left hemisphere, that of the map. The right hemisphere, that of the terrain. The brain structure as constraints. Understanding the structure of the brain and how it functions can help us see the constraints on consciousness. Much as, to use another metaphor, the banks of a river constrain its flow and are integral to its being a river at all. Without themselves being sufficient to cause the river. Or being themselves the river, or explaining it away. All experience in this life as we know it comes to us through the brain and is therefore inevitably constrained and shaped by it. It's important here to understand that this applies whether we conceive the brain as the originator or as a transducer, constrained and shaped by it. Transducer of consciousness. Everything is different. Against the view that whatever we have come to love, celebrate and honor is nothing but something else. Because nothing, whatever is ever the same as something else. That all that exists is more than we could ever be in a position fully to understand. That, far from being much less than we imagine, we are almost certainly far more than we can imagine. The whole comes before the parts. Although you may imagine that you construct the world by putting together the bits that your gaze lands on. Adding the pieces one by one and recognizing that this must be. Ta-da! Our study group room here at the City Library. No, in fact, it is the other way around. You take in the whole of the universe first. Then your gaze is attracted by particular parts. The exploration of complex scenes always begins with a global take. Very close to the whole and singular universe as depicted by famed physicist Lee Smolin. And this visual global take is characterized by short visual fixations. And this is definitely a key point. Long-range saccades. For you who want to look it up, it is SACCADE. They are extremely brief, rapid eye movements. Not directly under control of the will function. Which within a few seconds proceeds to a focal mode of processing. This correlates with shift of activity from the right to the left hemisphere. and that could also be a key to remembrance. We always unexceptionally go from a global, universal take, right hemisphere, to a specific, detailed left hemisphere take. Not the other direction. It's a rather hefty punch towards reductionism. How often do we say there's not enough information? One of the reasons schizophrenics are deluded is their tendency to jump to conclusions without weighing up the overall global take, whether the conclusions are probable. This is thought to be because of a need for closure. A tendency to prefer an answer irrespective of its plausibility. To ambiguity and uncertainty. This is a tendency that is also reflected in the culture of modernity. It encourages us all to rush for closure. When told that there are sheep and 5 dogs in a flock, and then asked, how old is the shepherd? Three out of 4 school children will produce a numerical answer rather than reply that there's not enough information. The modern educational system always goes from the specific in a want to capture the whole. Pupils are encouraged to count out the universal, the global, and slump together, thereby only accessing the left hemisphere. The similarities between aspirin and witch doctors. Studies of magical thinking in the context of ethnicity are few. But one carried out in New Zealand suggests that magical thinking is commoner among Maoris than among Western settlers. And there's more in common than one might at first think between the average Westerner's acceptance of the efficacy of aspirin and the African village's acceptance of a spell from the witch doctor. Neither understands or even asks for a causal explanation, but accept treatment on the basis of authority and past experience. Maybe a cup of coffee and some feedback. We can put in a pause first.
Hans, my question relates to this word, saccades.
Saccades.
Thank you, saccades.
This is the right hemisphere. Impossible, I think, to perceive yourself that if you go into a big hole like this one, your eyes will very, very quickly. Stop, move, stop, move. And it does that with your not knowing it. Those are called saccades, long drafting eyesights. And it doesn't cover the whole 360 degrees, but from that we have the global take. And in a couple of seconds it changes to the left hemisphere focusing. And since this is slower, comes afterwards, it could lead you to start thinking that is all there is. Saccades is very helpful to understand what is the universal global take. It's the thing that we are not aware of. And then we place this, for instance, this study group room in that reality. And maybe by time, when we shut out what is behind us, which is alarmingly dangerous for both body and mind, if you lose the connection to the backside of your body, the pressure on the lungs is immense, and the heart. So go out, expand, and leave your arms. Let them in an open position. So the open position, I would say, and taking in the background here, it helps to go the proper way of understanding things. And that is from the global to the specific. Whereas in education, we are encouraged to shut ourselves away from reality, to tense, to hurt, I would say, both body and mind, and then trying to overhardenly get the left hemisphere take, and that will always be wrong. If you don't go about the right order, you will always get the wrong answer. This is the modern day demise. I think I have a comment here from Kalle.
So you mean that this saccades is a kind of blinking of your eyes?
No.
No, it's not. Okay,
I recommend that you're going to, here you can use the internet and you can see some scientific, how it works.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But we are not normally aware of them.
Mm-hmm. But how does it relate to the free will or not having free will?
Well, you need to first have the global take for knowledge to come in, so to speak. It's a rather cute way of explaining what is reductionism in everyday life. Now, I will come into the left hemisphere as the will of the ego. While the right hemisphere responds to the realm of the world beyond the self. The left hemisphere expresses the will of the ego acting on the world or in the world. And since, as we have seen, the key advance of the left hemisphere in humans was to enable us to manipulate the world vastly more effectively than other animals. The consequences of damage should largely have to do with our capacity for utilization. In the left hemisphere, this could be said to be apprehending. You take the Latin ad and add it to prehendere, to hold on, to fixate, to narrow, to shut yourself from knowledge and thinking. And in the right, we have comprehending, to hold together. I like this one. The whole world. And that is from Latin cum, C-U-M, and prehendere. And then you start in the right order with the world, with you located in the world. The emotional differences between your brain hemispheres in keeping with everything else, we know about hemisphere differences. The right hemisphere is engaged in social bounding and empathy. The left hemisphere in social rivalry and self-regard. This explains the clear relation between sadness and the capacity for empathy, guilt and compassion, all of which appear to be associated with predominance of the right frontal pole. And elation with irritability, anger, insensitivity, and exuberant self-confidence. All of which appear to be associated with predominance in the left frontal pole. The change from functional to taxonomic categories. A person who views the world through pre-scientific spectacles thinks in terms of the categories that order perceived objects and functional relationships. When presented with a similarities type item, such as what do dogs and rabbits have in common? Americans in the 19th century would be likely to say, you use dogs to hunt rabbits. The correct answer that they are both mammals assumes that the important thing about the world is to classify it in terms of the taxonomic categories of science. Even if the subject were aware of those categories, the correct answer would seem absurdly trivial. Who cares that they are both mammals? That is the least important thing about them from his point of view. And here is a quote from Flynn, took from the book. the preference for taxonic answers, which is categories that classify the world, is extraordinary. It reached an even higher level in 2003. Today we are so familiar with the categories of science, and are so imbued with the scientific worldview that it seems obvious that the most important attribute things have in common is that they are both animate or mammals or chemical compounds. However, our ancestors in the 19th century were not mentally retarded. Their intelligence was anchored in everyday reality. We differ from them in that we can use abstractions and logic and the hypothetical to attack the formal problems that arise when science liberates thought from concrete reference. The hemispheres and creativity. All the literature on creativity in whatever field makes the same point. That it is about seeing unperceived parallels, seeing shapes or Gestalten that others have failed to see, standing back and taking the broad view, not squinting at the same microscopic field and looking up the rule book. Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Wrote Schopenhauer. Genius hits a target no one else can see. Virtually all insights involved a change in understanding. A surprising number of insights were triggered by inconsistencies and contradictions. The insights that were triggered by contradictions seem to depend on the person taking the anomalous data point seriously, rather than attempting to explain it away. The left hemisphere's inclination, as Ramachandran observed, a famed neurologist, is to preserve the model at all costs, dismissing an anomaly. The right hemisphere again according to Ramachandran is the anomaly detector, the devil's advocate. The modern campaign against generalizations there is a prejudice against broadly true generalizations. On the basis that we can all think of examples that do not conform is one of the prevalent fallacies of our age. All knowledge is uncertain, but not therefore invalid. Why we shouldn't doubt intuitive conclusions. Our intuitively conclusions cannot easily be proved. But neither can many. And perhaps all of our beliefs regarding the most important human concerns. All approaches are open to challenge, but it would be mindless to dismiss all approaches to important questions on that basis. It smacks of narrow-mindedness of the left hemisphere. On this basis, no one would ever be allowed to have fallen in love. You can imagine the fuss. What does it mean exactly to fall in love? What counts and what doesn't? Should we rely on self-report? With all the attendant problems? Or should we not measure something? If so, what? How many subjects should we study? who should or would count as control subjects? Whose judgment do we trust? Presumably no one's. So we gravely conclude the concept is meaningless. And the phenomenon an illusion. The left hemisphere simply ignores dismisses and ultimately denies the existence of anything it cannot pin down and measure. Brain disease as a type of being. Mental illnesses and brain diseases are sometimes discussed though they were like mechanical faults. But they are not. It is that the mind does not work properly. As if a component has ceased to function. In the first place, when something is altered in the brain or the mind, it is never just a component, inert and isolated. Brains and minds are living, constantly adapting, interconnected systems. And they are conscious. A brain disease or mental illness. Then is a change in a person's whole way of being in the world. I would call that Stimmung too, or mood. Iain McGilchrist calls it attitude most often. Being in the left hemisphere is a type of moral stance. A mental illness, then, is a change in a person's whole way of being in the world, or the world changes, and it does so in an effective way. Nietzsche and the death of myth. Nietzsche bemoaned the state of normal human beings, those semi-animals unhinged from instinct and no longer able to count on the guidance of their unconscious drives. Being forced instead to think, deduce, calculate, weigh cause and effect, unhappy people reduced to their weakest, most fallible organ, their consciousness. The schizophrenic is the apotheosis of this tendency in modern man. Nietzsche's prototype of theoretical man and his determination to destroy myth. Myth is otherwise known as the deep, embodied, imaginative understanding available to the right hemisphere. and seen by the left hemisphere as a lie. The paths to truth, the hierarchy of truth. Once the theoretical mind is untethered from the body and community, in which it is grounded and from which it receives its intuitions, there simply is no longer any solid basis for discriminating truth from untruth. And once again, one sees parallels in some kinds of contemporary philosophy and some kinds of belief systems driven by the irrationality of identity politics. Which led subjects to doubt everything except the validity of a bizarre conclusion which they feel driven to accept by formal rules. But never ever doubting the rules. Despite our always contributing to the reality we experience, there is something apart from ourselves to which we can be true. That reality, in other words, is not purely made up by our brains. There is a relationship there. Something to be true to, assuming there is something that to know implies that some understandings will inevitably be better than others. The difference between facts and process. A process is not generally completed at the moment it is alluded, but is temporarily open. It may be continuous and ever more coming into being. A fact is, however, intrinsically finished or established, which means standing firm. You can compare with stable. The collapse of the superposition is also stable once it happened, determined, unmovable. Localized. Do compare with Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle here. A fact is a thing, not a process. What makes something true? Is it coherence? A whole set of beliefs could be mutually coherent and entirely false. Everything depends on where you start from. If you start from the universal global, you will almost certainly be close to the truth. But if you start with the facts, the definition, and aggregate, pile them together, you will most definitely be wrong. A whole set of beliefs could be mutually coherent and entirely false everything depends on where you start from. How are we to judge the best place to start? If we believe the world is flat, we can hold a myriad of ideas that are coherent with that. But what's more, why do we suppose that truths may not conflict? Opposites may be both true. It is possible, I agree, to have amongst you your beliefs and overarching belief that contradictory statements may both be true, but this seriously undermines the usefulness of coherence as a criterion of truth. In chaos theory, divergence, untrue mixed with truth, is a necessity for understanding. The modern day idea of that truths are rational is absolutely disastrous. This have become, in contrast to earlier time, the pinnacle of academic thought, reason and coherence. It is poisonous for intellectuality. Modernity and rejection of truth. There are a number of deflationists, or in McGilchrist's view, defeatist versions of truth. One holds that the whole idea of truth adds nothing to a linguistic assertion that something or other is the case, and should therefore be abandoned. Relativists' versions suggest that since there is no one clear truth, everything being context dependent, once again the whole idea of truth needs to be abandoned. Each of us having our own truth. Social constructivism, at least in its strong version, suggests that truth is simply fabricated by society. Being in effect what the society holds to be true. An invention that, according to some, is used by a powerful elite to disenfranchise others. Some postmodernists leap from the uncertainty of truth to its non-existence. But this assertion is open to the obvious rebuttal that it is a truth statement, which asserts that the assertion that there is no truth is truer than its opposite, that truth exists. If we seriously doubted the existence of truth, none of us would get out of bed in the morning, because there would be no point in preferring any one course of action to any other. There would be certainly no point in writing or reading a book. And my longing for a meatball sandwich has now reached unimaginable heights. So if there are any comments, I can take them now, or whether there are none.
May they be silent in front of your meatballs.
I say thank you very much. I have to mention to you that try to reach the right hemisphere when listening to this. Because if you are in the left hemisphere, the message, which is not representationalist of Iain McGilchrist, could actually be lost.
Now, meatballs made me think about the last interview yesterday, the video that was released yesterday with McGilchrist, and meatballs made me think about the circular form. But McGilchrist says that the perfect form is not linear, absolutely not linear, because linear is the left side of the brain. The circular is better, right side, but he said, McGilchrist said that the spiral form is the most ideal, according to him.
How very interesting.
When you eat meatballs, think about this.
I will do, and the spiral is also something that the famed anthropologist and paleontologist Raymond Dart showed build up our body, a spiral. Spiral is also chaotic, which makes it strong. Thank you very much and have a very pleasant morning.
Thank you.